Hey, everybody. I just wanted to set the stage with this episode. This is an unscripted episode. I had the pleasure of sitting with a good friend of mine, Eric, and we just had some really meaningful conversation about addiction, family trauma, shame, recovery, transformation, life. And I wanted to share this with you. It is a longer episode, so if you can, please stay to the end because there are so many gems within this episode that I believe all of us can connect to. So without further ado, let's get into it. Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Man Uncaved. Shane, and I'm really excited about today because I'm actually sitting with a really good friend of mine, Eric. And this episode is going to be really unscripted because and we'll get into all this on this episode today, but we've had some meaningful talks, men's work, everything involved in that, and some great topics came through that. So I thought, let's go there. Let's be unscripted as fuck. Let's just go where we need to go and come out of hiding as men and talk about this topic. So, Eric, I'm going to kind of let you take it from here if you want to share anything about yourself, about our relationship, whatever you want to do.
Of course, yeah. Dude, I'm super stoked to be here, Shane. Thanks for having me, man. As you mentioned, we obviously have known each other since I went through treatment. And, it's funny that we're starting off this way because I was going to say that I just couldn't tell you how much I've appreciated the time that we've spent together. I mean, honestly, you've been a really huge part of my recovery. And I remember it like it was yesterday, the first time that I was in one of your groups. And, I looked a lot different back then, as you can imagine. And, just the energy that I got from you and the way that you're able to connect with me and just kind of like piercing through some of these layers that I'm sure we're going to talk about. It was something that I had just never really experienced before. So it was very, very instrumental and super impactful in my recovery and my time in treatment. So I really appreciate that. Thanks, brother.
Oh, brother, that means a lot to me. Thank you. I appreciate it. And you showing up in that. So that's really what it's about is I learned from you. So you know how this goes.
Symbiotic.
But thank you. Thank you for that. So went through recovery now. How long ago was that? If you want to share, what was
totally. Yeah. So I tried to get sober the first time in 2022 and I had hit what I thought was like my rock bottom. As you know, it's not really a bottom. It just keeps going. And I took myself into treatment thinking that I had just kind of had like a bad run. And if I got my thought process was that if I got my mental health in check, then I'd be able to go back to using and drinking like a normal person, which I now understand is, insanity. But so I went into a 90-day program and I didn't take it seriously at all. I was like drinking throughout the entire program. I'm shocked I actually made it through without getting kicked out. And I graduated from the program and I was just telling everyone the whole time, friends, family, that I was still sober. And then a couple months later, I went back out, as I guess you say, and cat was out of the bag. There was no longer a secret that I was no longer sober, but I kind of owned it. Like it was I had like a trial period with recovery and I realized, okay, I don't need that. That's not for me. And I had this weird sense of conviction that I'm sure we all get as addicts where like, you think you've figured it out, like you figured out how to beat the system.
Sure.
And so I just was in that state of mind for a year, and I just kind of went on a crazy tear. And by the end of that year, now, fast forward to around October, November of 2023, I went right back into that place I was a year prior, except it was just way worse.
Right.
So the second time around, I realized like how serious it was. And it took me, I guess, just that experience to understand like, dude, this is life or death. You got to figure it out. And I went back into treatment the second time around. I went back into treatment in late 2023. It finally stuck. And, so since then, I mean, I think right now in total, I have just under a year and a half sober.
Great.
I cannot even begin to say how blessed I feel. It's a word I never used to use, but how blessed I feel to have landed where I did, to have gone through the program I did, to have met the people I did, you, everyone else that helped me along the way. And so now I'm just in a place where you go from a year and a half ago to today, it's two completely different entities altogether. You wouldn't recognize me at one.
Thank you for your openness in talking about that. And I think it's something that's very interesting. Addiction has a point of view. And I think, and I'm just also just speaking from my own experience, it's the substance and all these, obviously there's more compulsive addictive behavior patterns. And it's so very interesting. And we're going to dive kind of into this. I want to understand more of your journey. And I think for other people to really understand. So sometimes we get this substance, and I use the analogy, I talk about this too, and you probably heard this, sobriety and recovery. And they kind of get interchanged in rooms, and people think, oh, sobriety, that's recovery, right? And I love the idea, and this is where I do bring up in groups too. It's like, okay, way that I understand it is the sobriety from my own personal journey. Sobriety is the abstinence. I'm just not doing the behavior. I tend to use the definition from the dictionary. I'm a little nerdy, but it says to retrieve something lost or stolen. That, when I read that, and many moons ago, I was like, that's what the recovery is. You pull this out, and then you see what's really been going on.
Yep, absolutely.
And I want to know, let's dive into a little bit of that juiciness, because I want to hear, now I'm not using, great, congratulations. And that is important. I don't want to, invalidate. That is the first thing, safety, stabilization. Let's get away from our substance, whatever. And then there's some stuff that was like buried deep underneath that. Can you share a little bit some of this new
the good stuff, man? Absolutely. So it's funny. I love that you touched on that, because as you said, recovery is defined as, something that was retrieving something back that was lost or stolen. And interestingly enough, for me, I had no idea what I had lost or what had been stolen for a lot of my life. Right? I'm sure we'll dive into this a little bit deeper. When it comes to all these underlying, emotions and experiences and our past traumas and things that we carry around with us all the time, sometimes we're aware of it, and oftentimes we have no idea it's even there, right? So it's like you said, the first part for me was like, okay, this is, DEFCON 1, I got to get myself sober. I got to stabilize. I got to figure out how to just stay alive. That's obviously the most important part. But then once you get a couple months under your belt and you start to realize, well, I've abstained from drugs and alcohol, and I'm doing everything everyone's telling me to do, and I still feel like shit, or I still want to kill myself every day. What's going on here, right? That's that stuff that you're talking about. And so, it took me, in all honesty, I started to kind of unpack or journey, your podcast called Man Uncaved. I was at the very, very, very bottom of my cave, just complete darkness, couldn't see anything. And I wouldn't say that I even started to move towards exiting the cave until I was probably in my late 20s. I want to say around 28 years old. I'm almost 40 now. But that whole time prior to that in my life, I had no idea, absolutely no idea that I even struggled with addiction ever, but B, what all the underlying reasons were that I think contributed to why I was an addict. And so, I come to find out that, like, hold on a second. My mom was a very, very heavy alcoholic. I used to say she was a violent alcoholic. I don't know that I would describe her anymore as a violent alcoholic, just because now that I've gone through my own experience with alcoholism, I understand her experience so much differently. It was a lot of like rage and resentment and hate and why me and my mom this and my mom that. And now it's like, I understand that differently. But addiction for me started in the womb. Yeah. And then from the time I popped out, it's like it was nothing but abuse. Like, I only really had my mom in my life for the first 13 years or so. And that entire time, it was just like a horribly toxic relationship between the two of us, which again, we can dive into how that ends up stemming into other things later in life.
Yeah, but let's pause for a second, because I want to paint this picture for you. Mom, dad, gone.
Mom and dad are both gone. Yeah, they both passed.
But I mean, I didn't know that. Thank you.
Yeah.
But I was actually, so that's another thing, right? So, but I was more looking at, you said it was only mom. Was dad not in the picture?
Dad was in the picture, but I would have never, ever described him as abusive. What I've come to understand the relationship with my mother was, I can clearly quantify that as abuse. And again, it's through no fault of her own. She was struggling with her own demons, right? But my dad, he was probably the kindest, softest, gentlest, like most nurturing. He had to play, we talk a lot about masculine versus feminine. He had to play both roles a lot of the time.
Sure.
So I had a wonderful relationship with him. However, even though I look at it now, I wouldn't describe it as abuse.
Right.
He was on the other end of the spectrum where he was just totally hands off. He was super passive.
Okay.
So even though he had all those qualities and those traits, and he leaned very feminine forward, which is what people tell me I do as well.
Sure.
It was this weird dichotomy, this weird clash between these two forms.
Lots of structure. Sorry, I'm going to cut you off right there.
No, that's okay.
These are important things to notice too, because even say there's a man there, and I think this is something very interesting to understand. Even though there's a man there, but this kind of hands-off passivity can also create a lack of structure. There's no boundaries there. There's nothing, because children love to push up against something.
Yep.
So there's non-structure. And then again, in the technical word, abusive, it might not be abuse in the way that we could visualize it. But the lack of structure could have some abusive quality to it, where it's not creating the structure, not creating safety in ways. It's just kind of, there could be some codependency patterns there. I don't know. It could go deeper. So I just wanted to put that because it's something really to highlight as you're discussing. So please continue.
Yeah.
Yes.
No, absolutely.
Non-structure. Mom is kind of in her patterns of behavior. And
very
this
aggressive
dichotomy you talk about, right? Can you explain a little bit more as you're becoming aware of this, like, where do I go with all this stuff?
Yeah. And that's the thing is, like, I was totally unaware of it the majority of my life. Yeah. Normal is what we know, right? So it's like all I understood at that time was just whatever was going on in the house.
Correct.
But after years of therapy, going through treatment, all the things that we do that we put into our toolbox, I finally realized, like, oh, okay, I've been dealing with this weird mercurial clash between two opposing forces that are completely opposite, in that my mom was always on 1,000, very aggressive. She was abusive, physically, mentally, emotionally, verbally, all of it, but it wasn't ever to the point where I would have known back then that's what it was. I thought it was just kind of normal. And then you have my dad, who's the nicest guy in the world, but he's completely hands off. So, the clash between those two energies, being around that all the time, essentially formed and shaped my understanding of how I viewed the world.
Yes, absolutely. On one side, you have a mother dealing with her alcoholism and maybe other compulsive behavior patterns, unpresent to the child in some ways, emotionally, spiritually, mentally, physically. And on the other side, you have this father who is in his own passivity, this hands-off approach, as you mentioned. Well, for that child, who's there to protect me, right? I am dependent on you, my primary caregivers, to guide me. I cannot do this without you. And so the child can interpret this as, I'm unsafe. I'm not cared for. I'm not seen. I'm not loved. I'm not accepted, and so on. Hey, everybody. I wanted to take a pause in today's episode to extend an invitation. If you yourself or you know anybody who may be dealing with addiction or any type of mental health issues, this can be challenging. It's not only challenging for the individual, but it definitely affects everyone around. So doing this alone can be difficult, as well as maintaining life's ups and downs. So I have a service. If you would love to find out what other plans are, what direction to take, I have a resource. For right now, you can reach me at manuncaved@gmail.com. Just put resource in the subject and give a brief description, and I will reach out to you, and we can talk about what needs you may need and possible direction and placement if necessary. Again, that is manuncaved@gmail.com. You do not have to do this alone.
Sometimes doing nothing is almost as bad as doing too much, right?
Absolutely.
So it's
Thanks for bringing that out. It landed on me as a man. So here you are, a boy. I mean, as you start to develop more and you get into adolescence, you start to realize, my son's 12, he's starting to realize he's going to be a man one day. And there's a natural tendency for boys just talking to the boys and the men out there, it's that the boy moves away from the mother. So they kind of move away in an energetic way from the mother, the maternal. They go towards the father. But here's dad. And how is dad showing up or not showing up?
Wow.
And it's not I think you brought light, you shed light on this earlier. Again, when we're doing this work, we have to understand these are human beings too. Mom's a human being. Dad's a human being. We're perfectly imperfect. It's not to make them wrong. I think what you did point out earlier is as we descend, we have more compassion and understanding for their own character defects or whatever you want to call them.
Yeah.
There are shortcomings because we all have them. So let's dive into a little bit of that, Eric, because as a boy and seeing dad, loving, caring, obviously, but the lack of structure, how do you move from this boy to a man where maybe it's like, where do you learn about all these things?
Yep. So such $1 million question. First of all, I learned what I would believe to be the first half of my life. Everything I learned was just a product of my environment. So I was kind of like raised by the world, so to speak, right? From the earliest memories I have, the second I was old enough to be on my own, I was out the door, sun up, and you wouldn't see me until the streetlights were on. I was around lots of extended friends and family. I had a couple different social circles, the people in school. So that's where I was kind of like acquiring all these tools or these understandings or these behavioral mechanisms that, again, now I had to learn how to sort of unpack as time went on.
Right.
But to your point, I kind of think of, as you're talking about it, I almost think of like the prodigal son, right? Like you go out and you have to figure out what's up with the world and you come back home. Well, that separation between the feminine, which is where we start, that's the beginning of our journey and where we spend the majority of our time maturing as animals, as beings. And then once we have a sense of, self-sustaining, where we can do things on our own, we break off, and now we're kind of supposed to be able to get that understanding, that prototype or blueprint of how to be a man in the world. Well, again, that was right where you say, I went to the edge of a cliff and just fell off, and I was just figuring out what to do along the way, right? I had no clue.
Right.
So I did learn a lot of that just as a product of my environment. Now, again, fast forward to, I almost kind of always look at things as like pre and post when I started this journey of like inner self, of going inward, because again, it didn't start till I was like in my late 20s. Everything prior to that, it was autopilot.
Sure.
Everything from that point on, the things that I've learned that have now kind of reconstructed, reverse engineered this new understanding that I have of what it means to not just be a man, but to have a masculine presence. Because those are two very different things that I think we get confused a lot of times.
Thank you. On that. No, these are great. This is going to be a long episode. So can you shed light on that one? Because that's important. So man versus masculinity. Is that the distinction? So let's go into that, because I'm in agreement with you, but I want to hear from your perspective. Can you tell a little bit more about that as your understanding?
Totally. My understanding, and again, it comes from everything I've learned along the way. I've been having so many epiphanies lately, and this might have been within the last year and a half, 2 years, but man and masculine were the exact same thing. There was no differentiation. I could not distinguish between those two. And then I started to kind of dive deeper into like when you start to understand your inner self, the shadows, this idea of everybody having both a masculine and a feminine side. I'm like, okay, let's do a little deeper dive into that. And I've come to understand that as a man, it's quite simply the objective version of the more surface level version of what I would say how we kind of delineate between ourselves and females as women, where it's all the kind of like, it's all the like logistics, right? It's like, as a man, like I have a certain biological profile, I have like a certain anatomy, there might be certain roles that historically speaking as men, and of course this has always changed and evolved over time, but there's maybe particular roles that my body is designed to do more effectively. My mind is going to be, kind of working as a counterpart to the female mind, which means that I might be looking at things from more of like a logical or rational perspective versus an emotional perspective.
Right.
it's important like that I kind of also distinguish the difference between, just because that's the case and we have this baseline understanding of like man versus woman does not mean that masculine and feminine necessarily correlate to that, because we all, whether are biologically, and again, I want to include everybody, not just, biological male, female, whatever anyone identifies as, whatever they're having, that inner energy, that inner sense of masculine and feminine is something that everyone possesses. As a man, I have both. I would probably argue in a lot of ways I have more feminine energy than I do masculinity in some ways. So the masculine energy, I think now we're kind of talking more on the spiritual level of what kind of energetically it means to experience our lives through the masculine or the feminine. Again, there might be certain roles or certain archetypes that are involved in those, but they don't have to, they're not mutually exclusive with your gender. They don't have with your biological being. They have nothing to do with that.
Right.
And so, now I've come to understand like, like even in my relationship, I see like, wow, the whole masculine and feminine thing at play has nothing to do with whether she's a woman and I'm a man, because all of a sudden she's making more money than I am and she's got a problem with that. And I'm not necessarily fulfilling the role that maybe it was expected of me to fulfill.
Yeah.
And these things are happening on a very deeply subconscious level. They're very, very deep within our soul. Right.
Oh,
so now all of a sudden we're not necessarily looking at each other. All of a sudden she has to be the more masculine one and I have to be the more feminine one, or vice versa. Right. And that can happen in any experience with any two people. So that's kind of like what I believe to now be the difference between being a man and having masculine energy.
On hold to these concepts and play. My whole thing is get in this sandbox, play around with these concepts, see how they work within your life. And I didn't have a father growing up, so that he was completely gone. It was kind of actually my father was an alcoholic, so he was absolutely gone. So that structure of learning and actually, to be honest, I can't actually recall a healthy masculine in my life at all. And kind of, so that child is reaching, and I just remember I would hang out with kids on the block, and we would do what they do, and that sense of belonging, and is this masculinity? And I was like, I got into like tagging at one time, which was a little ridiculous. But even at that, I was looking for some form of belonging, some form of identity, and not knowing that structure. That's why I brought that up, because I thought it was really interesting when you were talking about the dad who's kind of passive. Right. So then, do you see patterns for yourself of how you might engage in relationships? It could be romantic, it could be friendships with yourself, where the parameters are a little blurry because maybe we don't know how to express, or you don't know how to express yourself. So express yourself in certain ways, and because of that passivity that you were kind of conditioned to. And again, we are just fishes in like a fishbowl, right? Like, I love it. It's like, there's an ocean out there you didn't know about? Yeah. I'm a fish in a fucking fishbowl. I don't know that there's more out there. This is what's called normal. There's no comparative. There's nothing to compare to relate to.
Correct.
Until you get a little older. For me, I could say that when I got a little older, I'd hang out with some of these kids, and guess what they had? They had a dad. And then there was a little bit of like, wait a minute, what's happening here? Like, you have a dad? Like, how does that?
What is that all about?
How does that work in your family? So if you can maybe shed a little bit of light, and yes, let's dive into, we're gonna keep descending. That's why it's really unscripted. So everybody who's listening, just follow us. We're taking you on a journey today. We have no script for today. I love this deep dive, because these are the conversations that you and I get into. Just about these very interesting things. We start to wake up, and you're like, whoa. Look at that. Where did that come from, and all this stuff? How did that, again, from the passive dad, because we're looking at men, and we can get into the mother stuff too. Sure. But with the dad, what did that look like as far as like, how did you put boundaries? Did you have boundaries? Did you put parameters? Were you just the Mr. Nice Guy all over the place? What did you?
I'm sure you know the answer to that question already.
I probably do, but I want you to say.
Of course. Yeah. It's like ding, you say ding, ding, ding. It's like all hitting on the head.
Yeah.
So a couple things. Number one, yes. boundaries in particular were I want to say a problem, but they were almost non-existent. I didn't. Again, these are things I didn't know the concept of what boundaries are supposed to be,
Sure.
where we acquire them, how we understand them and enforce them. So quite naturally, because my dad being the way he was, and because I was trying to veer away from my mother and I was trying to seek safety in my father, I think I just kind of like he imprinted his way of being onto me. So I have always been what I would consider to also be a naturally passive person.
Right.
And, because that you combine that with like the people pleasing aspect of myself,
right,
and the insecurities. And, now as I peel back the layers farther and farther of my mental health and understanding, okay, wait, you've had actually pretty wicked ADHD most of your life. You just went undiagnosed for a long time. I wasn't diagnosed till I was in my 30s. So, and depression. I mean, it's just like you throwing all these ingredients into a blender and this is what you're going to get, right? So for me, I had no boundaries. I was extremely passive. I'm trying to please everyone around me all the time, which I'm assuming is some form of a trauma response, because when I walk into a room, if everyone in the room is okay, then I'm okay. Yeah. And so it's like, that became kind of my default, right? So how that sort of played out in relationships was very like, I wish we could just talking about just that.
Distorted all over the place, right?
So distorted. I mean, so distorted because you think you have a perspective or an understanding that's completely falsified by this sort of lens that you don't know is there, that you're seeing things through. And so while I think I'm really a nice guy and I'm altruistic and I'm this, I should be like a catch for all these women because I have a feminine side and I can talk to women. Right. In a lot of ways I relate to women more so than most men. Right. And, something that on that point, as you talked about, like how we grew up on the schoolyard acquiring things and, those boys might have had their own fathers. Even those fathers are coming from all different walks of life. So it's like, who knows what their own understanding of masculine is, right? That's being channeled down to us. I also think it's interesting, maybe we can talk about it at a different time, but the fact that I'd be interested to dive deeper into the idea that your father and my mother it was kind of like the yin yang, the opposite of each one. I bet
my mother was abusive in her own ways. I mean, there was physical abuse there.
So you were getting the whole yin yang. You were getting it all.
Yeah, I think there was definitely, again, so, I mean, just cut you off, don't lose your spot. Yeah, but
sure.
But definitely with my mother, I mean, you think about the classical alcoholic and codependent. I mean, my mom, I think at the true sense of it, had codependency issues, and I think there is still some codependency issues there. I mean, again, looking from her lineage of trauma. Sure. And so it just, and we look at codependency, this is why I think this is also important too. Codependency is an addictive pattern. It's addiction to relationships. So codependency is rooted out of shame, which I know we're going to talk about too. Yep. So it's rooted out of shame. And the tendency when you brought this up, so I want to highlight this for people when we look at it from the lens of, you talked about a trauma response, right? So we all heard the fight, flight. We heard the freeze for some people, and then there's the fawn. And the fawn is the people pleasing rooted in some codependency. And so we can take that into our adult life, and that becomes the pattern. It's more unlearning. You probably heard this before. Unlearning than learning. We are unlearning all the bullshit, and I think this is one of my groups I talk about. You're all addicted to the bullshit you keep believing, because that's what's in the way of how we're supposed to be, how we're supposed to operate. There's something that you said. I know I love that we're just going off on not tangents, but it's not too far off, because you said. I did grow up with a very woman household. So I had my mother and I had my mother's sisters who were actually very close in my age, because my mom is the oldest of 7. So, we were close enough in age that, so it was a lot of women that I grew up with. And that being that mom was, that dad was gone, men were the scariest place on planet Earth for me. I was also sexually abused by a man later in life. So, that had its effect. So I never gravitated towards men for safety, for comfort, or, to feel a sense of belonging, because those are the dangers. That was the clear one. Not till later I was like, oh, shit, I got some mommy issues too. But with the men, I never gravitated towards them for a sense of connection. And But like you had mentioned, so I would gravitate towards women for emotional safety. Now, I don't know
Mm-hmm.
about you. I'm just going to go ahead and call myself and come out of hiding. That is a dangerous place, especially when I'm in my
Yep.
addictive behavior patterns,
Yep.
because
Yep.
I know how to manipulate that. I know how to use
Yep.
that. I know how to get what I want. I can go and, can have sex, and I can do all these types of things because
Yep.
I'm that great, loving, emotionally available guy.
Yep. Yep.
And I don't say
Yep.
no, and I'm the yes man, and all of that shit. And that's
Yeah.
another thing, because as you're looking at it from a sense of of the absence of masculinity, I don't know how to hold myself and have direction. I don't have focus. I don't have purpose. I didn't know how to say no.
Same.
Because deep down, because again, dad's gone, mom is there. Deep down, if so, there's rejection on, not rejection, but there's abandonment, dad,
Abandonment. Mm-hmm.
emotional deprivation, neglect from mom. So the
Mm-hmm.
fear of being alone, the fear of being abandoned, the fear of being left was so prominent. I had to be a yes man. See, because if
Yeah.
I say no to you, you might be angry, you might leave me, and then you're going to go, and then I'm abandoned once again. That little
Right.
child that is holding onto the story
Yep.
gets
It just
ignited.
triggers.
Yep,
Yep. Absolutely.
absolutely.
Yeah. No, that's everything that you just said is like, it's so funny. I'm glad we're talking about this because, again, imagine the whole point of what you're doing here, right? It's like, imagine the amount of people that probably experience the same thing, but we don't talk about it. Because,
Yep.
again, you hinted on shame in there, which I know we'll get into. But shame has to be one of the most powerful emotions, if not the most powerful emotion I've experienced, because living in a world of shame is what keeps me buried at the bottom of that cave and what keeps me completely disconnected from my understanding of what we're talking about now. So like you said, and I think it's true that what you're describing about how you're going through life and how that's manifesting in relationships
Right.
was exactly what I experienced. But again, I just didn't know that's what it was. I was operating under this guise of like thinking that everything that I was doing was like in this magnanimous way. But in reality, it just turns out that I was just like hiding behind this like avatar that I'd created because of a bunch of shit that was given to me or that I acquired along the way or whatever the case may be that I had no idea was even there. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So to your point, I'm going through my entire life seeking that safety, seeking that comfort, not knowing that's what I'm doing. And like you said, you marry that with addiction,
Yep.
and now we could have a pretty serious problem quick. So
Right.
my entire life, right? And again, I'd be curious because did you ever know that was what was happening, or did it take you till much later in your life?
Yeah, let's take a thank you. Hey, I love it. Ask me questions. So,
Yeah.
this is good. It took me a while to really understand it. You said something earlier, and you talked about everything. If my outside is good, then my inside is good. So
Yep.
when I look at that, and I'm just using my understanding of that, that is the child, right? So the child is so merged with their parents, whoever's there, mom, dad, whoever's there, they're merged with them. They don't know where one ends and the other begins.
Yep.
So if mom is happy, then I'm happy. If dad's
Yep.
happy, then I'm happy. If they're not happy, then we don't know that we can actually be okay. If you could be not happy and I can be happy.
Yes.
Because we're just absorbed in all of this. There's no individualization. There is no self-actualization. And I think that's kind of what recovery is. And the bigger idea of recovery is that we can have the self separate of you, mom, of you, dad, of 8 billion people. We get to make our own choices. So in your question, what I was looking at, what I started to really zone in out in my own recovery is something that I think that we talked about in probably one of the first groups. Is what are the gains? So imagine that all behavior is purposeful. Now, with every behavior, there's an ultimate gain and a payoff. So what is the gain? Let's just use alcohol or drugs or whatever, right? And I think you were part of that. Well, you ask the group of people or person, and they say, relief or validation or control or power or love or acceptance or belonging or safety, comfort.
Yep.
Okay, great. So what are those things then? These are these emotional needs that we needed as a child. So we are constantly reliving this like worst day cycle all over again, reaching everything good outside. This is my whole thing. Everything good outside, the ego, which is the child within us. That's what the child first does. So we grasp, like you left me, right? You don't leave me, right?
Mm-hmm.
You.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're talking about it from the lens of shame, and this is why coming out of hiding, shame is about hiding parts of ourselves. I'm ashamed of that part of myself. So I hide it from the
Mm-hmm.
world. And what I do is I
Mm-hmm.
create a false self. Now that false self talk about addiction, becomes an addiction because within
Yeah.
that false self, I'm guaranteed I'm going to be loved. I'm guaranteed I'm going to be
Yes.
safe. I'm guaranteed. Now I'm attached to this false self as my
Yep.
ultimate God to
Yep.
save me from what? Save me the pain. Because God forbid, Eric, I don't want you to see I'm flawed. I don't want you
Yep.
to see that I'm
Yep.
imperfect as a human being. Because then
Yep.
you're going to see
Yep.
who I really am. And then, oh my God, you're not going to like me and you're going to leave me
Yep.
and you're going to
Yep.
reject me. Right?
I'm
And
gonna be
on and on
abandoned.
and on.
It just taps into all, it took me a while again to realize that when I went to treatment this time around, I was talking to my therapist, she goes, you might be 38 years old, but inside of you there's a 9-year-old who never grew up and who never had any idea what,
Yeah.
like, that a lot of, so much of your life went on past that point. And that was kind of a wild concept. And so again, there was like, I love that you touched on the idea that we create this version of ourselves, this persona that's going to be able to get, it's the gain, right? Like, what am I going to be able to get if I become this person? I get those things, so I'm going to be more of that person. But since I have an addictive personality, I'm just going to get lost in that person. And before I know it, I have no idea which one's which. Like, I don't even know the real version of me and how I'm projecting
Correct.
myself to the world, right? But like all those things that you talk about with shame, first of all, it's extremely deceptive because, as we mentioned before, we don't always, not only do we not always know, more often than not, we probably don't know what's actually going on inside of us internally and the reasons why our ego is naturally wanting to protect us from these things.
Right.
So, all those behaviors that we're exhibiting throughout our lives that we think are being kind of sort of like they're coming from a different place in our mind. We think it's coming from a place of positivity or it's coming from a place of, confidence, maybe, for example. In reality, the grand scheme of things, like you said, it's coming from a place of, I don't want to let anyone know what I really have going on inside, right? And so for me, to your exact point, that's kind of how I operated through my entire life. And that's why that transit, like when you start to uncover this, and when you start to, dive deeper and deeper into that cave and realize what's been buried down there for the entirety of your life to that point and start pulling it out, now, not only do you not want to show it to anyone else, I don't want to see that for myself. Like, that's some of the hardest stuff that we have to deal with on our own, right? Like, wait, hold on a second. You're telling me, like, I did my inventory when I was doing my steps, and I had like 26 character defects on there, and I was fine with every single one of them except one. I saw the word womanizer on the page, and I go, I'm not a womanizer. What do you mean, womanizer? Are you kidding me? Like, I've spent my whole life being the nicest, most loving, most caring. And I'm like, okay, wait a minute. I might not have ever laid my hands on a woman, which I never did and I never would. I've never sexually assaulted a woman and none of these things. But, as you said earlier, have I manipulated myself to be able to get some version of what I want?
Yeah.
Huh. Yeah. Have I said something that maybe wasn't truthful to be able to get something I want? Yeah. Have I put on a different persona or version of myself to get something I wanted? Yes. And as you said, it's about that gain, because even if I'm just lying in bed with a woman for one night, I'm getting that sense of comfort out of that I never got before. And it's going to really boost up my ego. So, it's all those things are connected, man.
And that's my whole thing. Everything is everything. When you really start pulling back and you start seeing sequence instead of the frame, you start seeing how everything is connected. You're like, holy shit, I've been living my life like this.
Yes.
And this is why I think it's important. And I love that we're having the discussion. We'll dive deeper on this topic. But what I really love and why I love this, that we're having this discussion now, is because addiction gets a certain point of view. There's such a stigma, whether people are actually saying it or not, it's felt.
Yes.
And I think because we don't understand what is actually happening.
Yes.
I mean, this idea, if addiction was a conscious thing, there would be no need for treatment centers. There would be no therapy. There would be nothing.
Right. we'd be fine.
But it is so
Yeah.
unconscious, and so it goes back to
Yeah.
the second actual definition of recovery is a retreat to come back to a sense of consciousness. So we are, and
Mm,
as Carl Jung talks about, we have to bring that unconscious into our consciousness because you
mm,
cannot heal or fix something you don't see.
yeah.
There's no
Yep.
way you're
Yep.
going to know, and that's the
Yep.
shadow. Those are
Yep.
those disowned parts of myself. We can kind of segue into that. I love it. The
Yep.
universe just
Yep.
works that way. But those are those disowned parts of myself. Why? Because there's such shame, or I was made to believe to be ashamed of that part. So I disowned
Mm,
it within myself because
mm,
I don't want
mm-hmm.
to know that it's there, and
Right.
I don't want to have to feel that there, and that's the
Right.
whole I think. There's you know. I don't know if it shouldn't. I don't know how those words are, but the
Yeah.
idea
Yeah.
of being ashamed of ourself. Ourself is the most beautiful thing. It is the most beautiful thing that we have. All the messiness, all the sadness, all the just
Yeah.
all over the place. I love that.
Imperfections.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. It's what
All of
makes
it.
us. Right?
Yeah. Hmm.
So, speaking from that shadow part in these identifications with false self, we attach them for survival. And of course, they were, and they're adaptive. Thank God we
Hmm.
created them.
Right.
Thank
We
goodness
needed
that we
them.
created these adaptive things to survive. We wouldn't have
Hmm.
made it. I had to push my feelings down at age 2. I had to.
Yeah.
What was going on in my household? I had to. I didn't do that
Yeah.
consciously as a 2-year-old
Right.
and go,
Right.
"Oh my God, this is so painful. Let me push this away." Right?
Your brain's like, we're good here.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
But my brain,
Yeah.
and that's what's so crazy because our brain does that naturally. More pleasure,
Yeah.
less pain.
Yep. Yeah.
And then
Makes
we
total
like
sense.
clear out the wreck. We're like, oh shit, move my drugs out of the way, move my behaviors out of the way. And I'm like, whoa, there's all that. I've been
There's
hiding
me.
for so long.
Yep.
Hey, look, doesn't matter how much time I have, you have. I'm still learning. I'm still trying to
Right.
come out of
Right.
this hiding. That's why this whole
Right.
thing has come out of hiding because there's so much, and maybe that's what life is. And that when
Yeah.
we can stand in our truth, the more free we will be. It
Yeah.
will be
Yeah.
uncomfortable, guaranteed.
Yeah. It's some of the hardest work I've ever had to do, and it's like, as you were saying that, I was kind of envisioning like, I'm all about visuals. I'm all about metaphors. And I'm thinking about that cave, right? And, as you touched on it, I like to call it having a white belt mentality. No matter, I could be a triple black belt in jiu-jitsu, but every time I walk into the dojo, I have a white belt as far as I'm concerned, as far as anyone else is concerned. And so you're always learning from that place, right? And so a lot of this, just because we're having the conversation to this point in our lives of what we have accumulated, the knowledge that we've acquired, what we've experienced has
Right.
given us a certain perspective. It's not like we're at the edge of some understanding and that's all we're going to ever understand. That's that. It just keeps going and going and going, right? So it's like this idea of this cave. When I normally would visualize it, it's like there's a bottom and there's an opening. But in
Right.
reality, it's probably just this infinity continuum where just some parts are probably going to look darker than others. And I do think that, I try to look at life in terms of, and this could be a different conversation, so I don't want to go too far off on a tangent, but for me, I've changed my view on the ideas of good and bad over the
Right.
course of my life, and right and wrong. Obviously, there's some things that are pretty obvious, but I think that it's really more of a matter of light and dark. I think that, there's times when we experience darkness and there's times when we experience light. And I think ultimately there's light in everybody. I think there's light in everything, everywhere, all the time. There always was, there always will be. So if we can't see it at a time, or if it's dim, or if it's just completely off as far as we're concerned, it doesn't mean it's not there. It just means that we haven't seen it yet. And so
Right.
for me, that journey that you talk about was kind of this uncovering and sort of uncaving myself. And the more and more that I would realize exactly what you said. Hold on a second. This is a me thing. Like, this is something that I've had going on inside of me my entire life that I've been trying to deflect or defend or ignore, whatever the case may be. And now, as a 38, 39-year-old, I'm having to face these things quite literally for the first time.
Mhm.
That's not easy for anyone, right? So that's why recovery in any form
Right.
it's such a massive undertaking. I've done some fairly difficult things in my life, and I can safely say now, after going through 2 rounds of rehab, and actually it's sticking to the point that it has now, God willing, one day at a time, there's nothing, easy. And or I always say that easy is not synonymous with simple. It could be very simple to understand something, but it doesn't mean that it's going to be easy to accomplish. It's, going through the steps was some of the easiest ideas I had to conceptualize,
Right.
but the work itself was some of the most difficult work ever. So as you mentioned, you're kind of trying to have to attack it on two fronts, where first of all, you have to even be able to understand it. So you have to kind of like peel it apart so that you even know it's there.
Mm.
And then second of all, you have to realize that this is not necessarily just about my, obsession with a drug or an alcohol, or
Right.
fill in the blank, with sex, with food, with gambling, with
Thank
porn,
you.
with, the
Yes.
whole 9 yards, right? It's not just those things. It's what is all of that exists with the self within the self, as you talk about, with the shadow that's been designed to protect you. So, again, for better or worse, it actually did do some good for us. That's why sometimes it's hard to say. And disclaimer for anyone listening, if they are struggling with addiction or if they are, addicts, I never want to say this as if I'm glamorizing it, but at times there absolutely was moments where it was probably exactly what was saving my life. Smoking marijuana at that moment in time was probably exactly what was saving my life.
That's
because
right.
I didn't have any other tools. I wasn't equipped with anything else to know what to do. And as you mentioned, all I needed to do was whatever's in reach in my vicinity, where can I grab pleasure and where can I completely avoid pain?
Right.
And so, that's something that, as we talk about, shame and this idea, that's why I love that it's called Man Uncaved, is in the whole thing. I love it all. I love you. It's great. But just like that idea of coming out of that is very multidimensional.
Yeah.
It's not just about abstaining from drugs and alcohol.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's come out of hiding in all of these areas that we live in the smallness of who we actually are.
Yes.
And we don't live
I like
in the
that word.
bigness. And where we can, and I love that you brought in many ways we can mood alter, right? Relationships are mood alteration. Obviously, we got drugs and alcohol, gambling, food, work, money, anything that
everything.
we got these phones that we can stay buzzed on, and dopamine hits all over the place for hours. And so recognizing what's there. Why sometimes do I need to go and distract? I'm alone. What's wrong? I always get this thing where people talk about, and sometimes other groups, it's like boredom. I'm like, what's wrong with boredom? What is wrong with boredom?
Yeah.
Because there's nothing going on and there's not the world of distractions, all of that shit starts to come up to the surface. But that's what it is. It's not boredom. Boredom's neutral. Boredom doesn't have anything. Boredom's like, I'm just bored. Nothing's going on, right? It's what comes up from that place.
Yeah.
I always love the expression that our happiness and our joy is created by the relationship we have to the experience, not the experience itself. So relatively, everything is neutral. I am coming in to this neutral thing, and I'm creating an experience. And of course, that experience is from my own understanding of what it is.
Yeah.
Because you and I will have the same experience, but you see it a whole different way.
Totally different. Yep.
And I'm like, wait a minute, you see it that way? I see it this way, right? So obviously, start to descend, start to go deeper and deeper, and you'll find that little part of you that maybe is scared to be alone. And we touched on it briefly. Yes, we're looking at family dynamics. We're looking at family of origin, but you did shed light on that. So I do want to bring this up. This is kind of, this can go down in legacies, man. I mean, it could go into great, great, great grandparents. And if you understand the many layers of the word that I use, and this is where my training a lot comes from, is trauma. Think of humanity itself, right? From religious persecution to racism to the Great Depression to women weren't allowed to vote. I mean, those are going to be traumatic on whoever is experiencing that. And that will have an effect, guaranteed, on that generation. And that's why I think it is important for us in our responsibility in this lifetime to show up and do the work to look at that. And to do so we can change that. There's all of us have that self-responsibility.
Yes.
If we want a different world, if we want a different thing, whatever you want, it is your responsibility to be part of that solution, not part of the problem.
Correct. Yeah. Transgenerational trauma.
Yeah.
Just like it, I mean, from the beginning of time for eons, people are if someone is experiencing all the things we're talking about, but we don't have the language for it, or we don't have the motivation to figure out what it is, and we're just operating on that sense of autopilot, there's a manuscript and we're just passing it down from generation to generation. Right. Here, this is how you be, this is how you exist, right? And so you couldn't have said it better. I think, if I had to, I like to ponder a lot. I get very existential, and I like to think a lot about, like, what is the meaning of life, and why are we here, and what is our purpose? And if I had to nail it down to what I believe to be like one core true purpose that every one of us has, it's exactly what you just said. It's how can I make something a little bit better than it was before I got here? How can I make the world a little bit better of a place? How can I break some of those transgenerational curses and traumas that have just been passed down from family unit to family unit over the course of all of time? Right. And so, you can't, you have to have these conversations, and you have to do that self-work. Like, that's, people think of addiction as, like, as you said, it's like there's stigmas around it, and it's like a sign of weakness. Or my favorite, it's like, well, can't you just say no? Right. And it's like, you'll never understand what it's like from the inner workings of struggling with, a constant craving or obsession for something if you think there's just an on-off switch for it. But, what's so fascinating to me about that, number one, is that as an addict, I now recognize that I have the ability. We are dealing every day with a beast inside of us that we have to contain. It's our choice. Mm-hmm. But we don't know that that's a choice. We think these behaviors are all automatic for a long time, right? And so I've kind of come to understand, okay, wait, I recognize what's been going on in my life, what my parents experienced, what my parents' experienced, and how that's now all been transferred down to me. I have a choice, though. I can do something different with it. I don't have to just take it all and turn around and pass it to the next person in line, right? I have, like you said, almost a moral duty or a civil obligation to try and break those transgenerational curses, right? So, what I like to say oftentimes is that having these conversations and getting that out in the open, there's a phrase that I heard once that reminds me of every time I have this conversation is, we can't heal, we don't reveal. Mm-hmm. So if we don't know something is there, it's like the first thing, what do they say? The first step in solving any problem is understanding there is one, right? These are just like a little collection of all these little problems that we've piled up inside of us that we don't know we've ever had. So obviously, step one is to do the searching. It is to do the seeking. It is to go inward, which is going to be some of the hardest work we've ever had to do, right? Absolutely. Because knowledge is not the solution. Knowledge is just sort of the foundation or the baseline of knowing what we need to do in order to create that world for ourselves. Mm-hmm. And, it's probably why Nike's one of my favorite brands of all time, dude, because they figured it out. Like, just do it. Right. There's a major difference.
Action-based.
Action.
Yeah,
all action.
Just do it.
There's a huge difference between the world that we can construct and live within in our mind's eye, in our imagination, in our brain, versus what we do to actually create a tangible result in the physical realm. Right. They're two very different things, right? So it's like, for me, step one is kind of understanding it. We obviously have to do that, which we're never going to do if we can't talk about it. And now step two is, okay, we've been able to identify these things. Now, what are we going to do about it? Right? Correct. Like that's the meat and potatoes of it.
Yeah. Man, well said. And that's why it's important that us, and if it's men or whatever gathering you're sitting at, is we have these type of discussions, because I think that's why I love my group dynamics. I have to tell you, because if you and I are having this discussion, right, and you're just talking about yours and dad and mom and those dynamics you grew up with, and little Timmy over here on the side is like, wait a minute, that's not normal?
Yes. Yeah.
Little Timmy didn't know that that's not normal. Like, I thought that was perfectly fine to be like, whatever, whatever that choice. Yep. And the power lives, and then you see the awakening. And speaking to that, we've been talking, and one of the expressions that I really love is, when do we not see our shadow is when we're standing in the dark. When do you see your shadow? When there's light peering through. And what I have found is in these, healing, whether it's the rooms of recovery, support, therapy, whatever you're doing, you're creating a sliver of light into the darkness. Now, the more that you keep going on this path, you start to widen the light. Yes. So now you see more shadows and more shadows. Yes. Correct. Light, right? But it's the best work I've ever done. I mean, I've kind of flipped, and I think I kind of hear the excitement in yours. It's like, Painful, yes. Scary,
Yes.
yes. Sad, yes. All of that.
Yeah.
And how exciting, because I'm growing and I'm
Yes.
learning and I'm evolving and I'm changing. And from that place, that pebble hits that pond and it ripples. And now
Yep.
you share this with your buddy. And your buddy gets to feel like, how do you do that? Show me. And then
Yep.
the wider
It's
and
a
the
stranger
wider,
at the market, right? It could be anywhere. It could literally be anywhere.
anything.
It just keeps, it just keeps doing that. Yeah.
Anything.
Yeah.
I mean, again, it
Yeah.
doesn't have to just be recovery, just about
Yep.
little gems we pass to each other that
Correct.
just kind of creates that little bit of light in maybe the other person's eyes that wasn't there a
Experience.
second ago. And
Absolutely.
that is making a change. So yes, look, if you want to go global, we need it, right? Like go
Right.
global, go big,
Right.
right? I love
Right.
that.
Right.
But
Right.
just like even in conversations like this, the people you cross paths with, share
Mm-hmm.
stuff time with, how do I leave that
Mm-hmm.
conversation? Right? How
Mm-hmm.
do I leave
Yep.
that? And again,
Yep.
it's not that it has to be perfect. So if it's not perfect, how do we come back and repair it? How do we take
Yep.
responsibility? That in itself, accountability, when you start throwing that language at people and you're like, wow, that's mine. No justifications, no minimizations. I recommit,
Yep.
and own it without
Yep.
like going into the UFOs under my backyard. And that's the reason why. And I got abducted in the traffic and the snow that came down in LA. It was like, nobody gives a shit about all the reasons why. Just
Yeah.
own your
Yeah.
shit and let's keep it moving. Own and
Yeah.
recommit.
Yeah. That takes. God, we could probably have this conversation for
I
days.
think we're going to have to, because I don't know if a episode might be a
I
lot
know.
for you.
No. Maybe we'll close it off and we'll have a 2.0 version. But, that takes everything you just described. There's a couple things that in my head that I captured I wanted to highlight that you were talking about. But
Go.
that takes a certain level of vulnerability. That's a big one, right? Vulnerability is another word that I think, especially within the male culture, within the masculine culture, is a word that is not looked on in a particularly positive way, right? We associate it with like being vulnerable is like, what are all the things we say? You're being a sissy, you're being, you're a girl, whatever it is. Like we just immediately assume that's like a feminine trait, right? But no, there's nothing stronger, in my opinion, than to completely divulge all of who you are to the world without zero regard for what anyone's going to think or say back. That takes to show the true form of yourself and completely disregard what anyone's going to have to think or say about it. Takes an immense, some of the strongest willpower that you can ever imagine. It's like, that's why in recovery, a lot of times when people say like, oh, you're weak, make no mistake, if you're an addict out there and you're listening to this right now, I promise you, every minute that you try to persevere through that disease, through your addiction, that is the most courageous and strongest thing anyone could ever do, right? So number one, it's like we have to peel back some of these misnomers, these misconceptions, the stereotypes or the stigmas, like you said. So it takes a lot of vulnerability. And, as you were talking, there was a couple things. I'm going to keep feeding off the light analogy because I think we're cruising with that, right?
Yeah.
And so, I was applying for my master's, which I didn't end up getting, but I wanted to pursue a career in therapy. And so I was applying for my master's and I was stuck on the application process for weeks and weeks and weeks. And I couldn't figure out how to close my mission statement. Every time I would sit down, my fingers would just freeze and lock up. My brain would just go blank. And I just didn't know what to say in this final part. And I'm coming up on the deadline. It's days away. And mind you, at this time, I was pretty active in my, pretty heavy in my active using, right? But I decided one day, I can't sit at the computer anymore. And I went downstairs and I turned on Netflix and I just picked some random show and some random episode that someone had told me to watch before. And, there was a quote. It was an interview between two people. And one of the gentlemen on the interview had asked, what do you think is the purpose of life? Touched on that a little bit ago. And, your idea of like this spreading of the light is exactly what I think this is all about, right? And, the other guy in the interview said, well, I'm not sure anyone knows what the true meaning or purpose of life is, but I can tell you that I've heard what I believe to be the closest explanation for it. And I believe he said that he was quoting Beethoven. And this quote has stuck with me ever since. It goes, the purpose of life is to get closer to the divine than any man before, and then to disseminate the divine rays amongst the rest of mankind. And I just remember thinking that I had to like say it over and over and over in my head to even get it. Cause I'm like, I know I understand it, but that sounds so complicated. Wait, hold on. And I'm just like, it's like a tape. I'm replaying it over and over again in my head. And then I realized, wait, no, that's actually quite simple to understand. Whatever your divine is, right? We're all going to have a different understanding of the divine to us. But whatever our divine is, if we can spend our life's mission and purpose, our dedication to getting as close to that thing as we possibly can, and then rather than keeping it to ourselves, turning around and sharing it with everyone else that we can, imagine if every single person on the earth did that. It quite literally would be a matter of every single person just being their own form of light. And wherever they go, they're illuminating that path for someone else along the way. And, you know, call me a hopeless romantic or an optimist or whatever. But if we did that long enough over a long enough period of time, we would accomplish, you know, like in the Kabbalah, when it talks about light being like the ultimate source, we would accomplish that. It's a binary fact. There's no way around the fact that if everyone just exhibited that behavior and they made that their life's mission, we would just touch everything and everyone in the world, and we would just be this one completely connected unison being. And that, you know, to me, ever since I heard that, that was definitely what I have come to understand. Even just a conversation like this, you know, it's like that's what I've kind of understood my purpose. That's why when you ask me, I'm like, where do I sign? Like I love to have these types of conversations.
I know.
So,
thank you.
Yeah.
No, that was a beautiful image. And I think we're going to have to go ahead and continue to have more of these episodes, because there was so many. That's why this one was really unscripted, guys. There was really no plan. I'm like, Eric, let's just talk and get it on tape.
I love it.
Because the way that we kind of piggyback off and take that concept and run with it over there, and then we're going to run with it over there.
Like these subgenres. Yeah.
And I think there's this beauty and this poetry that lives in there. There's a rhythm that lives in there. And that's what I really love, is sometimes, you know what, maybe we just don't need to be scripted. Let's just get human. Let's just talk about our own. And we could definitely dive more into this. This was a great starting point, and we could probably pick. There's probably 10 topics with this in this.
We can pick
that we can actually run with. But when I edit, I'm going to have to put all that together. But where you left off, I think, is a perfect place. How can we be that light? How can we spread that light? And
100%.
Taking that image with you as you walk through your dailies and the relationships that you walk into, or the people that you see.
Yep. Everything you do, right? It's just, if you do it, if you're just exuding that light everywhere you go, I mean, it's impossible. Light always wins, right? It's like scientific fact that if there's darkness and you flip on a light, the light's going to win every time. So I just kind of think that that's, you know, for me, it's become this human connection, these conversations, this gaining awareness of self and understanding. And, you know, to be able to materialize that into something that I feel I've now had a sense of purpose towards, which I didn't really have my entire life prior to now. There is something tangible, which for me, the vehicle or the vessel by which I'm choosing to accomplish that is by helping other people who struggle with addiction. Because that is something that now I know, you know, if you would have asked me a year and a half ago, like I said earlier, why me? And I have two sisters, which again, I'm all women too, right? We must have been surrounded by mostly women, which is why we have that both elements. But you know, it's a lot of the why me, why me, not why not my sisters? Why was my dad not an addict, but my mom was, and I was the only one in the family who seems to have gotten, you know, been stuck with this shitty disease. And now you fast forward to a year and a half later, and it's like, you couldn't take my addiction away from me if you tried. Like I would defend it with my life, you know? And so if there's any possibility of moving the needle in just an iota of a direction closer to someone else being able to accomplish the same thing, I feel like I've lived my life's purpose. I've done my part. So, you know,
beautiful.
It's been huge for you having me on this. I can't thank you enough, man. I'm looking so forward to having more.
Led from a group to here to like talking, man. Well, I love to say, welcome home, traveler. You come a far way to get here. Welcome
Thank you, my
home.
friend.
Yeah,
I feel very home. I love it.
Anyway, thanks everybody who's been listening. Again, this is Man Uncaved. I am Shane. This is my good friend, Eric. I'm so glad to have you, man. I really did. I just love your wide lens. I love your energy. I love your enthusiasm for this work, and
Yeah.
I'm so excited to have you. And I definitely want to have you again because, like I
Oh
said,
yeah.
we can piggyback on like 10 of those topics. But I don't know if I can
Yeah.
keep our listeners going for 2 hours. So
That's
there
okay.
is that.
That's okay. We will be having many
Yeah,
conversations.
I love it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Unscripted, just unscripted, and we'll talk more about that. But anyway, so
Yeah.
this is, again, my name is Shane. This is Men Uncaved. We need to come out of hiding.